Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. I'm the host, Sean Boyce, and I'd like to welcome my guest to the show today, Margaret Hall, who is the CEO and co-founder of the GreenLight Fund. Hello, Margaret. How are you? And thanks for being on the show.
Hi, Sean. Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be with you.
Yeah, I'm very excited to tell this story, as you can imagine. But before we get into that and dive deeper into the GreenLight Fund, if you wouldn't mind, so that our audience can become more familiar with you, can you go into a little bit more information about your background and how you got to where you are today?
Sure, absolutely. So I'm based in Boston, which is where the GreenLight Fund is based, but I moved here about 21 years ago from Atlanta, Georgia, where I was for the first many years of my career. Mostly working in the nonprofit sector. I both worked during the day in the nonprofit sector with organizations that supported nonprofit organizations to be more effective at delivering on their missions with management consulting and professional development training for their employees. I also was very involved in the founding of an organization called Hands on Atlanta, which is now part of a national network all these years later, that collectively are leading and engaging people in direct service in their community. So I had this background in Georgia and in the early part of my career in both helping nonprofits be effective in delivering on their missions and engaging people in the work of nonprofits in ways that strengthened the community and built community. And so I moved to Boston in 2001 to go to the Kennedy School at Harvard to study nonprofit management, leadership, policy, and did that and had an opportunity while right after that to join the Center for Effective Philanthropy when they were just getting off the ground. And I worked with them really as a fellow, and kind of what they added to the mix of the things that I had experienced so far was how we think about philanthropy and how we fund organizations, fund nonprofits to get the kind of impact as funders that we want to see in the community, and also to prove our value as funders in the community. So when I first began to think about and work toward launching GreenLight, what I was bringing was this mix of how do you prepare organizations to effectively deliver on their missions, to be effective organizations in all the ways any organization company needs to be effective. How do you engage people in that enterprise as volunteers? And also, how do we fund organizations to help them be effective and impactful? And so my path crossed John Simons, who is my co-founder in GreenLight, who is a for-profit entrepreneur and investor, and also a nonprofit entrepreneur and investor. And so I can tell the story about GreenLight's history and founding, but that sort of brings me to the moment of when I crossed paths with John, my co-founder, and have been in Boston since then, working on GreenLight, first in Boston and now in 12 cities around the country and growing.
It's an incredible story. And the first thing I'll say is thank you for everything that you've done. This work is so incredibly important. I know GreenLight has a long history of success here in helping enable and empower these nonprofit organizations to drive incredible impact. And you're saying so many things I want to dive into, and we will, I promise. But before we get into that, I don't want to miss an opportunity for you to talk a little bit more about GreenLight Fund's mission and help our listeners get a better understanding of what it is, how you drive impact, those types of things.
Great. So GreenLight's a national organization, but we're very much locally focused and work at the local level in our now 12 cities. And what we're about is really helping bring change for people who have experienced barriers to economic mobility, who have and are navigating poverty and working hard to move out of poverty and stay out of poverty. Often they are facing barriers that are rooted in inequities, long-term inequities, racial inequities that really have created poverty in our cities in a certain sort of way, concentrated in particular ways, and affecting disproportionately Black and Brown residents of our community. There's a long-term history of setting up the conditions for that to happen. So what we're about is really trying to change the trajectory for folks who navigate poverty, and but very focused on the local level. And what we do in order to do that is provide a tool that communities can use to do something that just doesn't happen as a matter of course without a green light. And that is to help communities identify where there are the greatest barriers to economic mobility. There are the greatest needs that people in the community see that we need to overcome in order to make economic progress, and have the kind of inclusive prosperity we want. And so when we find that need, working with the community, could be early education, it could be high school graduation, it could be college persistence, all the things that we know help move people out of poverty more permanently. When we identify that need, GreenLight then goes and looks around the country for what's really working to bring to the community to meet it. So it allows communities a way to not only identify needs and gaps in services on the ground where they need something innovative to make the kind of progress they want, but instead of sort of recreating something locally or innovating something locally, really using what we know works because it has a track record of working. It's got a base of evidence that we can look at. And so we're sort of this matchmaker between community needs and what's working around the country, bringing that into the community and funding it to come into the community, and then working closely with the local and national leaders of that organization to make sure it gets rooted deeply in the community, gets the impact that we've been able to see in other places, and importantly, is sustainable in that community over time. And so we can unpack how we do that. But it's really, you can think of GreenLight as this match between community needs and social innovations that have been created and proved out elsewhere, in order to help communities make the progress that they want to see.
It's fantastic. There's so many interesting elements to the work here, which I think is critically important for this world of driving, delivering, scaling impact for the population of people that need it most, which you've done an excellent job articulating. And I think it is a shining example as well in terms of also what's possible, the capabilities that we have if we approach tackling these problems and challenges in a certain way. And I know GreenLight's got a long history of having done that successfully and empowered these organizations to do so. So definitely want to dive into that a little bit further. Before we get there, probably worth adding to what you had kind of alluded to towards the end of what you just were talking about, and that's how GreenLight essentially drives impact today. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about some of those details as well, too, in terms of the work that you do, which sounds very pragmatic and data-driven, which me being a tech geek, obviously I love. So I'd love to hear you talk more about that.
Yeah. Well, first and foremost, what we want for our communities is impact for residents who are navigating poverty and identified ways that they need support navigating out of poverty. And so impact for us means measurable, observable change. So if the issue that's been identified is college persistence and graduation, we don't want to know just how many people are participating in the program. We want to know how many people are actually staying in college because of the program and graduating from college because of the program. So we do that in a couple of ways. One, as we are doing the diligence on organizations before we bring them into the city, and that's about a 9-month diligence process. So it's an intensive diligence process. You can think about it like the kind of diligence and vetting a private sector investor would do in a company before making a significant investment in them. But in any case, we're looking at the evidence that has informed the development of their program. So is it really based on what we know is true about the field that they're in terms of how you get impact? And then we are also looking at their evaluation, so their track record of getting results themselves. And so we're looking for organizations that use data to manage and drive performance. They have the tools, the internal tools to collect and analyze that data and know what the results are, and are using that data in a smart way to not only know if they're making progress in getting the results they want, but also to change and course correct, because we very much believe that conditions change. Conditions can change city to city. So if organizations aren't collecting and using data to understand what's working and not working, then they're going to miss opportunities over time, or they're going to neglect the kinds of improvements they'll need over time. But we also want to know what outcomes that they're looking for, and whether or not they have evaluated whether those longer term outcomes are being achieved.
Fantastic. I love the differentiation too between the, inputs, outputs, and outcomes, right? There's
Right.
a lot of talk, and I want to get into a topic related to that, which you've alluded to as well. Before I do that, I was going to ask you about some of the language that I know you use, which I imagine you're choosing very precisely, which I think helps quite a bit to get everyone aligned in this world, which increases the probability of progress and impact and scaling that impact. And I've heard you say numerous things multiple times, like evidence-based, results-oriented, the innovation. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about those terms and what they mean in this world, why they're so important for driving impact.
Well, they're important for driving impact because in order to know whether or not what you're putting money into is producing what you want and what the community has said it needs, you need a way of measuring it. And you need a way of measuring that is validated, that is that meets the standard of good evaluation that we know exists in terms of how you measure it, how you develop experimental trials and ways of evaluating, just to know if these are if this is solid and valid measurement of what we're looking for. And then it's also really important, in this work, where it is we're talking about behavior change. We're talking about organizations that support people through relationships with those people, which is how you get behavior change over time. And so in addition to the numerical data, the quantifiable data, the experimental trials and evaluations, we also want to see a way of assessing and evaluating that's really based on the satisfaction of the end user, people who are using these programs. Are they meeting their needs? Are they being delivered in a way that is culturally competent, meets the needs of folks who are in the situations that they are in? Because that is so important to making the kind of change that our communities want to see and the residents that our organizations are serving and supporting want to see.
Well said. And I think that also lends itself well to the outcome-oriented element, which is we want to be as effective as we can with where the investment's going, right? So we should be able to leverage things that we see elsewhere, even outside the nonprofit sector, in terms of what delivering those results ultimately look like. So I love the evidence-based approach because that can really boil it down into the numbers that says, where have we really been able to drive impact? And as such, which have been the most effective, that may also be warranted for additional investment into that to drive even greater results. So I really like that approach there. It's very pragmatic, so to speak. So that the tech person in me is a big fan.
Great. Yeah.
What I was curious to pick your brain about as well also is something I've heard you kind of allude to a certain extent. And I know GreenLight has a thorough process they go through in terms of figuring out who to partner with and ensuring that the results are ultimately there. But then from what I've come to understand as I've learned more about your wonderful organization and the amazing team members you have that do great work, is GreenLight's also doing a lot to combat this problem that I call kind of the strings attached problem in the nonprofit sector, which is oftentimes, And this is something that like Ann May Chang and Lean Impact, she talks quite a bit about that in her book, where the funding sources sometimes for a number of these mission-driven initiatives can be tied to funding, which is associated with a certain like focused, as you talked about already, focused almost more on an output, which may or may not be relevant to driving the outcomes, which are related to the impact that we ultimately want to achieve. And I believe GreenLight, from what I understand, is doing quite a bit to make progress there as well also, which says, after we have vetted and understood that this organization is driving real impact, then we make the investments and we let them do what they do best, because we know that they're able to take those investment and then ultimately deliver the successful outcomes. I'd love to hear you talk about that challenge a little bit in terms of what that landscape looks like in the nonprofit sector and what other leaders and executive directors can potentially do in order to try and make progress against it, because it may be holding some people back.
Yeah. And this has been something that the nonprofit and philanthropic sector has looked at and talked about for a while. And it goes back to, for me, my time at the Center for Effective Philanthropy, that was really looking at best practices in philanthropy in a number of dimensions, but certainly from the standpoint of enabling nonprofits to do what they're set up to do, which is to deliver impact in communities. And so we designed GreenLight in a way that honored what we know works with nonprofits, to really help them. As somebody said, we want to fund you to win. We want to fund you like we truly believe in you. And so we do have a thorough diligence process for these organizations. But when we select an organization and we put about $600,000 into getting them to our city, that is $600,000 of general operating support. The only condition is that they use it to come to our city. But how they spend it in our city, it doesn't matter to us. What we're partnering with them to do and funding them to do is to use the expertise that they have, because they are the experts at doing what they're doing, to deliver the impact of the outcomes that we're looking for. And we've diligenced them, and we know that they've gotten those outcomes in other places. And so, so that's part of it. It's the general operating support over multiple years, trusting the nonprofit to be the expert in what they do. We are not the expert. And then I would say another aspect that has been important to us from the beginning is partnering with those organizations and not only putting dollars into them, but putting our relationship capital into them, our networks into them. So, part of what we are trying to address with the GreenLight Fund is the fact that even the best nonprofits with great leadership, great models, well executed, evidence that they're working, don't necessarily get where they're needed. They don't spread and scale at the level that we need to have the kind of impact across the country and cities across the country at the level that we need them. And a big part of that is you can build capacity at the national organization to scale out. But when you hit a community, all the dynamics at the community level are at play. You don't know folks there. This is a very relationship-oriented enterprise. Funding is based on relationships. Partnerships are based on trust and relationships at the local level. So our role with these organizations and the sort of capacity that we give them is those relationships. It's saying it's partnering with them at the community level, making introductions, being sure they meet the folks that they're going to need to be successful in partnerships, in navigating the funding community and navigating the local political environment, and avoiding the obstacles that can come up if you don't know how a city works. And so that deep partnership with them, that deep trust in them, that being willing to use our capital beyond the dollars, but our relationship capital, our relationships in the city to help them get set up quickly, rooted deeply in the community to get the impact and sustainability we want. Those are sort of the elements that that we've implemented in how we support and fund organizations. And they're elements that any funder can use. It's the idea that you trust organizations to be the experts. You're not the expert, the organization's the expert. It's the idea that you fund them at a level to win with general operating support, not tied to a particular program, but taking into account that it takes strong IT, it takes great leadership, it takes expert staff to deliver those outcomes, and then trusting them and partnering with them and making introductions for them and having a kind of relationship with them that they can come to you and say, this isn't working, what should we do? Or I'm trying to get to this person or this entity, how you can help. I mean, to us, that's really support, going all in for organizations and supporting them to win, supporting them like we're fully behind them, and we mean for them to be successful, and we'll do everything we can. That's really been wired in from the beginning for GreenLight.
It's fantastic. I got to imagine having a partner like that makes all the difference for a lot of these organizations. So your approach is certainly admirable, and obviously the results-oriented element proves the fact that that's working quite well. Next, I was going to ask about plans for the organization or GreenLight Fund to kind of scale impact from where you are today. What do those plans look like? Can you share those with us?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, we have been supporting for the last almost 20 years, now 45 replications of organizations into one of our cities. So we've run this process and supported an organization come into our city to meet needs, and really been looking at how organizations scale their expansion model. And so over the last 10 years, we've been scaling ourselves, GreenLight. So it's sort of very meta, we're supporting scale and scaling ourselves. And I wish I could say we had avoided all the challenges of scale and replication, but I think sometimes you just have to learn your own lessons. We knew a lot, but we've learned a lot. But we are continuing to grow GreenLight. So we're in 12 cities now. We just recently opened Chicago as our 12th city. We are finishing the exploration phase and planning to launch Denver in early next year. I'll put in a plug for folks in Chicago and Denver, or people who know folks in Chicago and Denver. We are hiring executive directors in both of those areas who are rooted in the community to run GreenLight in their communities. And so the way we're scaling impact, in addition to supporting organizations in a way that we know helps them scale to our cities and then scale in our cities and sometimes statewide, we are also scaling our impact by getting to new cities to be able to run this process and have impact in cities. And we've really seen our scale tick up exponentially as we add cities, and now we have 12 and growing cities running this process. So, last year alone, the portfolio organizations, the organizations we've supported in our cities, reach more than 500,000 individuals just in 1 year. And so, so that is really, we're really seeing that increase tremendously, and that's how we'll be scaling our impact.
It's incredible, and congratulations on the progress. And by all means, anyone listening in, definitely would encourage you to take a look at the opportunities GreenLight Fund has available, especially in those cities as the organization is growing. That's very exciting progress. Beyond that, Margaret, I wanted to thank you a ton for being here, sharing this message. It's incredibly important and really provides the level of support that those that need it most really need. Beyond that, I was going to ask you if there's any other messages you wanted to share with us that can be helpful for your organization in terms of how people can get involved and support.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'd love to stay in touch with folks. So if you want to come to our website, greenlightfund.org, and sign up for our newsletter, we have a national newsletter. We also have newsletters in each of our sites. So you can sign up for the national one or an individual sites. And if you're in one of our cities, would love for you to get on that local list as well, to stay abreast of what's happening in your city. And I can say the cities that we're in are, let me see if I can get all these right now: Boston, Philadelphia, the San Francisco Bay Area, Cincinnati, Detroit, Atlanta, Kansas City, Charlotte, Newark, Baltimore, Chicago, and Twin Cities, St. Paul and Minneapolis. And then we're working toward Denver. So sign up for the newsletter in any of those sites. Sign up for the national newsletter to find out when GreenLight's coming to your city. And if you know folks in Cincinnati, which we're already in, but we're hiring an executive director there, and Denver and Chicago, we'd love to hear from them.
Amazing. Thank you. I do want to make sure we get the website URL mentioned in the recording as well, too. So please feel free to share that. You don't necessarily have to spell it. For any of the listeners, please check the show notes. We'll have any and all of the links that Margaret's mentioning listed there as well, too. So on your phone or your laptop device, whatever, however you're listening to this content, you can go into those details and see those links, or just click on them right there. But I do want to make sure we capture that URL. And then in addition to that, Margaret, I'd love to hear for to share with us as well. Also, if there's anybody in particular that may want to reach out to you, how they should do, who should be thinking about reaching out to you, and how should they think about getting in touch?
Great. So the URL is www.greenlightfund.org. And folks can reach me at info@greenlightfund.org. That's the email, info@greenlightfund.org. And, I would say reach out if you know great organizations that are scale worthy and scale ready and are working in some way to help folks increase their economic mobility and move folks toward more inclusive prosperity. Reach out if you are a funder who works in this area, is interested in what we do, or interested in what any of our portfolio organizations do. Reach out if you're in a city that GreenLight's in and you want to get involved, or you're in a city that you think GreenLight should be in. So welcome that from anybody and everybody, because our hope really is, and our vision really is, that every city has GreenLight that can play this kind of role and be this kind of tool to help solve or address the challenges that hold people back from making the kind of inclusive prosperity and economic mobility that we want to see.
Thank you so much for that mission statement, Margaret, for taking the time to record this episode, and for all the wonderful work you and your team at GreenLight Fund have done thus far, plus those plans to scale and grow from here. So I'd encourage all the listeners to reach out, get involved, support the organization any way that you can. I'm happy to do so as well also.
Thanks so much, Sean. Really appreciate this opportunity and the work you're doing to spread great news.
It's the least that I can do. You're very welcome. Thank you again so much, Margaret.